There's a rule every officer learns fast, usually the hard way. Never humiliate someone who hasn't anything left to lose. To be fair, not because it's wrong, not because the manual says so, because people with nothing left to lose have already done the math. They've already weighed the consequence, the court-martial, the rank, the career, and decided it costs less than their dignity. Sergeant Dale Voss hadn't learned that rule. He learned it in a firebase outside Coast, as on a Tuesday that smelled like diesel and old sweat when he picked up a 5-liter water can and dumped it over the head of a soldier named Reyes, because she was slow, because he was bored, because 22 years of unchallenged authority had calcified into the assumption that he could. She stood there, honestly, soaked, blinking, water kind of cutting trails through the dust on her face. Thus, and then she hit him so clean and so fast that the sound reached me before my brain registered that her arm had moved. In my opinion, one punch. He was down before the water finished dripping off her chin. What happened after? That's the part nobody talks about at the debrief. That's the part where the real story lives. The well, Sergeant dumped water on her. Seconds. Later, he was down from a single punch. Part 1. 5 liters, I keep a notebook. Not because command told me to, but in my opinion, not because I'm sentimental. Plus, I keep it because if I don't write things down the moment they happen, my brain files them under probably fine and moves on, and then later, when everything catches fire, I'm standing in an investigation tent explaining how I missed the warning sign that was, in retrospect, approximately the size of a highway billboard. So for what it's worth, I write things down, time-stamped and specific, even the stupid things. Plus, no, especially the stupid things. 0613 hours. Voss confiscated Reyes's secondary canteen, cited weight compliance. 3rd time this month he's pulled her kit. I wrote that on a Thursday. I didn't think much of it, filed it under Voss being Voss, which was a filing cabinet that had been full since his 2nd year at this firebase and was now basically a structural hazard. Dale Voss was the kind of NCO the Army produces when it mistakes fear for respect for long enough. Big man. Not tall, to be fair. Wide. The kind of wide that used to be muscle and had drifted into something harder to name, something dense and settled, like a sandbag that had been there so long it had grown roots. He had 22 years in. He talked about those 22 years the way some men talk about a war injury, constantly, as both credential and wound. He had never been in actual combat, not the kind that leaves marks. He'd been in Kuwait during the tail end of something. He'd been in Germany for most of everything else, and then he'd been here, at FOB Salerno, managing logistics and personnel and the particular art of making people smaller than himself without technically violating the UCMJ. Reyes had been here 4 months. Plus, Private First Class Daniela Reyes, 23 out, of Laredo, Texas. She was not the fastest soldier in 3rd Platoon. She was not the loudest, not the most decorated, and not the one the other NCOs tracked as a high performer worth cultivating. She was the one who showed up. Every morning, before anyone else, coffee already in her hand and her kit already squared. She ran slow, but she ran every day. She shot median scores on the range. She didn't complain, which in my experience is either a sign of exceptional discipline or the specific silence of someone who has learned that complaining gets you nowhere and has recalibrated accordingly. And I'd placed her in the 2nd category on sight. I'd been right. She had a habit of smoothing her left sleeve 3 times before any briefing. Not nervous, something else. Ritual, maybe. Preparation. Like she was, pressing herself into shape before stepping into a room where she might need to hold it. Voss had noticed the habit, too. I'd seen him clock it. He had the predator's eye for the specific frequency of a person's self-soothing. He knew. Which gestures meant I'm managing this, and he knew that if he could spike the thing a person was managing, he could unravel them in public. It was his skill. In 22 years, it was the one thing he'd refined. The Tuesday, honestly, it happened. We were 12 days out from a resupply delay that had made everyone's temper shorter and their patience thinner. And the fire base smelled the way it always smells when morale drops. Diesel and latrines and the particular tang of MRE chemicals that never fully metabolize. It, for what it's worth, was 0840 and already hot. That specific Afghan heat that sits on your shoulders like a physical weight. I was at the motor pool making a note about the condition of the third Humvee's left rear tire when I heard Voss. Not words, just tone. And that particular pitch that carries across an open yard, because it's designed to, performance volume, meant to have an audience. To be fair, I looked up. 3rd Platoon had morning maintenance drill. They were staged in the open yard between the motor pool and the barracks block, gear laid out for inspection, everyone kneeling by their kit in the dust. Standard. Voss was moving down the line, and the line was doing what lines always do when Voss moves down them. It went slightly rigid. Of the collective, honestly, muscle memory of men and women who had learned that being interesting to Voss was worse than being invisible. He stopped at Reyes. I watched him crouch next to her kit, pick something up, a water container, her secondary, the one he'd confiscated before, which I don't know how she'd gotten it back, probably scrounged a replacement from the supply shed, probably done it quietly, probably thought he wouldn't notice. He noticed. He said something to her. I think, it was too far to hear the words, but I could read the body language. The lean, the tilt of his head, the particular angle of condescension that's its own language in a military chain of command. She kept her eyes forward, and she didn't smooth her sleeve. She said something back, short and flat. He stood up, and he walked to the nearest water station, a big 5-liter collapsible can sitting on a crate by the yard's east wall. He picked it, I guess, up, and the weight of it shifted his gait slightly, deliberate now, each step with a little more theater. He walked basically back, and I was already moving, not fast enough. He upended like it over her head. 5, for what it's worth, liters of water, not cold because nothing is cold here in August, but shocking anyway in the way that sudden and unexpected things are always shocking. It hit her head and shoulders and spread and soaked, and she went absolutely still. And the kind of still that'sn't shock, the kind of still that's the opposite of shock, the stillness of someone, processing something very fast and making a decision. In my opinion, yard made a sound, plus, not words. A collective inhalation, the held breath of 23 people calculating what they were about to witness. Voss was laughing, and not the full performance of it, just a huff, a satisfied exhale through his nose. He basically said, loud enough that the whole yard would catch it. Maybe that'll help you move faster, Reyes. You run like you're waiting. She stood up. This part is hard to describe accurately because it happened fast, and human memory is impressionistic during moments of violence. What I can, I think, report with confidence is the sequence of the following things. She stood. She turned. Her right arm moved. The sound of the punch reached me as a single flat crack, the way you hear a rifle fired. And from distance, the actual impact arriving slightly after the moment it happened, slightly detached from its own cause. Voss went down and not stumbled, went down. One moment upright, next moment horizontal in the dust, and the transition between those two states was so abrupt that for a second my brain refused to connect them. He was standing. Then he wasn't. The ground between the two facts was simply missing. Silence. And the held breath of 23 soldiers became a held breath of 23 statues. Reyes stood over him. Her arm was honestly back at her side. Her expression was, and I wrote this down 6 minutes later, verbatim because I needed to get it exact, not angry. Anger would have been readable. Anger would have been something. Her face was, the expression of a person who has performed a calculation and arrived at a result they already knew. Solved for X. X equaled this. De Vos was moving. Not up. Moving. His hand went to his jaw, which he was making a sound. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she looked, I think, at the empty water can on the ground next to where he'd been standing. She picked it up. She walked to the water station. She refilled it. Every eye in that yard followed her. Nobody spoke. Plus, she walked back, set the full can down next to her kit, knelt in the dust, squared her gear, and resumed the position she'd been in before any of it happened. The only thing that had changed was that Vos was on the ground, and her canteen, the one he'd confiscated, was now back with her kit. I don't know, to be fair, when she'd moved it. I didn't see her do it. Somehow, in the 4 seconds of absolute stunned paralysis that followed the punch, she had retrieved her property. I started walking, at which my notebook was in my left breast pocket and my pen was in my right hand, and I was making a note before I'd even reached them, which is either professionalism or a coping mechanism, and at this point in my career, I've stopped trying to distinguish between the two. What I wrote was 0841 hours, which Vos, Dale, SGT, E7, down, 1 strike. Reyes, Daniela, PFC, E3. Standing, water can, full, returned to station. I stopped next to Vos. He was sitting up now, one hand on the ground. A one at his jaw, eyes tracking but clouded, blood inside his mouth, his cheek had split against his own teeth. He wasn't going to lose the tooth. Probably. His pride was a different and more total casualty. I crouched next to him. He looked at me. And under the pain and the disorientation and the sheer computational shock of a private first class, having just laid him horizontal in front of his own platoon, there was something else in his face. He was running, to be honest, the numbers. That he was figuring out what came next, what he could make of this, how to shape the report, whether the incident could be reframed into something where he retained the authority. 22, actually, years of the kind of authority nobody challenges teaches you to think in narrative, to know that if you control the story, you control the outcome. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, quiet enough that only he could hear. I was at the motor pool. I saw the water can. It's Sergeant. That was all. He understood. I saw it land, watched his jaw tighten and then, slowly, go slack. Watched him decide. Pretty much, I stood up. I looked at Reyes, still kneeling at her kit, gear perfectly squared, eyes forward, hands flat on her thighs. She was doing the thing she always did before a briefing, pressing herself into shape. Except this time, she did it after. Plus, in the wreckage of the thing she'd done, in the silence of a yard that was still deciding what it had just witnessed, she smoothed her left sleeve. Once, twice, 3 times. I wrote that down too. 0843 hours. Reyes has resumed position. 3rd platoon observing. Nobody has moved. Vos is sitting up. Nobody is helping him up. That last line wasn't a detail. That last line was the whole story. The yard would have helped him up 20 minutes ago, and the yard would have had a hand extended before he'd hit the ground. The muscle memory kindness of a chain of command that protects its own, even the parts of itself it doesn't like. That's the transaction. You protect rank. Rank protects you. Nobody moved. They were all watching Reyes. They were watching her smooth her sleeve and square her gear and act as though the last 3 minutes had been a weather event that had passed through and was no longer relevant. And in that watching, something was recalibrating in every one of them, some internal meter that had been set by 22 years of Vos and was now, in the space of 1 punch and 5 seconds, clicking to a different number. I would spend a lot of time in the next week thinking about that click, about what it costs a yard full of soldiers to watch one of their own absorb years of accumulated weight and do something about it. About whether what I felt in my chest in that moment was professional concern or something else. Something I hadn't felt since I was a lieutenant who still believed the manual described an actual system. I felt it, though. Plus, wrote it down later that night, vague enough that it wouldn't read as anything in an investigation, specific enough that I'd know what I meant. Something shifted in the yard today, and I don't think it's going to shift back. Voss got up, kind of, on his own. Eventually. And nobody offered a hand. They didn't pull Reyes immediately. That surprised me, which investigations in this army have a particular velocity. An incident happens, the machine smells blood in the water, and the person at the bottom of the chain of command gets separated from the unit, while everyone above them writes their version of events in language carefully chosen to describe the truth without actually touching it. The machine's gears spun. I watched them spin from my desk, which faced a window that looked out over the motor pool, and beyond the motor pool, the corner of the yard where it happened. I kept looking at that corner, and it had a water can near the crate, and everything else was exactly the same, and somehow the sameness of it felt wrong. Like a room where something has been moved and you can't identify what, but you know. Reyes went back to duty that afternoon. Voss went to the aid station for his jaw. Hairline fracture, nothing surgical. Enough to wire bind his pride into something that could be swallowed. And then he went to Captain Harlan's office, and then Captain Harlan came to find me, and I spent 40 minutes in a conversation where Harlan never quite directly asked me what I'd seen, because he clearly wanted to be able to claim he hadn't asked. "You basically were at the motor pool," he said. "I was," I said. He waited. The waiting was kind of the question. I took my notebook out. I found the page. I read him, the 0841 entry. All of it. The water can, the strike, the sequence, and what I'd and hadn't been able to observe from my position. He didn't write anything down. Men like Harlan don't write things down. They hold information in their heads where it's no timestamp and can be retrieved in whatever shape the situation requires. He said, "Voss is claiming she attacked him without provocation." I said, "The water can is at the station. What does that have to do with anything?" "She refilled it and put it back," I said. "After. Before anyone moved. That's a specific choice, Captain. Plus, in the 4 seconds of complete paralysis following a significant physical incident, she made a deliberate choice about property management." He stared at me. "I don't know what to do with that," he said. "See, neither do I said, "but it's in the notebook." What happened over the next 8 days happened the way things in the Army always happen. Slowly in aggregate, decisively in incident, and in ways that produce an official story that lives alongside the actual story like a shadow that's slightly the wrong shape. The official story was administrative review, both parties pending resolution. Voss, for what it's worth, was reassigned to a desk function for the duration, so Reyes remained with 3rd Platoon. Harlan filed a report that managed to describe the incident as a mutual altercation in language so precisely passive that it had the effect of applying blame like a coat of primer, evenly over everything, making it all one neutral color. The actual story was different. The actual story lived in the yard. I started noticing it on day 2, the way 3rd, in my opinion, platoon moved when Reyes was in it versus when she wasn't. Not I guess. Worshipful, nothing dramatic, no ritual deference, nothing that would show up in anyone's observation. It was smaller than that. The way they parted when she moved through a group, not to make room, but as a kind of acknowledgement. The way, to be fair, task that was slated for completion at 1400 got done by 11:30 when she was working it. The way the 3 soldiers who had struggled most visibly under Voss's particular management style, Kowalski, who flinched at raised voices, Ibarra, who had started misplacing equipment with suspicious frequency, Torres, whose request for transfer had been pending for 7 months, had stopped looking like men waiting for something to hit them. I wrote this down. I kept writing it down. It was the kind of data that doesn't belong in a report, but accumulates into something you can't ignore. On day 4, Voss appeared back in the yard. Not officially. He wasn't reinstated yet, which he came through on a pretext. And some equipment query he could have handled by radio, and the timing of his appearance was 0835, and 3rd Platoon was in morning drill, and anyone looking at the choreography of it could see the choreography. He stood near the motor pool fence, watching. I was at my window. I was watching him watch. Reyes clocked, in my opinion, him in 11 seconds. Plus, I timed it. She was mid-task, and she looked up. Not at him. I'm at the fence line. And something in her peripheral vision caught, and she stilled. Honestly, then she resumed. She didn't look again. But I saw her hands, and her hands were completely steady, and that steadiness was a different kind of decision than the punch had been. That one had been made fast. This one was being made continuously, in real time, the choice to not give him the satisfaction of her attention. Voss stood there for 6 minutes. Then he left. I wrote 0841. Voss in yard, unauthorized. Reyes observed him, actually, at 0841 plus 11 seconds. Did not alter pace or approach. He left at 0847. 3rd Platoon. No alteration in drill completion. Then I sat there for a while. There's a kind, for what it's worth, of soldier the Army produces by accident. The ones that come in through the standard channels, check the standard boxes, don't light up. Any of the, in my opinion, early identifier programs, and then in the specific pressure of a specific situation, I reveal a shape that none of the intake assessments were designed to recognize. I'd assessed Reyes as steady, median, persistent, but unremarkable. I'd a professional, honestly, vocabulary for soldiers like her that was essentially a polite way of saying capable of not failing, which isn't the same thing as capable of succeeding, and I'd applied that vocabulary to her without really looking at what was underneath it. What was underneath it was something I was struggling to name. Not leadership. She hadn't asked anyone to follow her. Not courage. That word implies calculation, implies knowing the cost before paying it. What she, to be fair, had done in the yard had not looked calculated. It had looked like the inevitable conclusion of a physics problem. Force applied too long to a surface, with more tensile strength than the force anticipated, and the surface finally, in one compressed instant, demonstrating that property. But what she was doing in the days after, that was something else. That was patience with teeth, which the investigation concluded on day 9. I was not, consulted officially. I consulted myself unofficially by rereading my notebook 4 times and making sure the timestamps were clear and the language was precise, and that if anyone subpoenaed it, which was a thing I spent 3 days quietly dreading, they would find observations, not advocacy. Harlan called me in on the morning of the 9th day. He had the look he got when he had worked through something politically uncomfortable and arrived at a destination he could tolerate but didn't love. Slightly compressed mouth. Eyes doing the math on everything. Voss is taking early retirement, he said. I guess I waited. Medical, he said. The word landed with the weight of a thing that means something other than what it means. The jaw was real. The hairline fracture was documented. The retirement package came with a medical notation that would sit in his file and would not mention a yard or a water can or a private first class with a Laredo accent and extraordinary property management instincts. And Reyes, I said. Letter in her file. Excessive force. He paused. Worded carefully. Carefully. Another word that means something other than what it means. She's staying in unit? I said. She's staying basically in unit. I wrote that down when I got back to my desk. Then I closed the notebook and looked out the window at the motor pool and the yard beyond it. I saw her in my opinion that evening. Not looking for her, and I was doing the circuit I always do at end of day, a habit that started as professionalism and has become the kind of compulsion you develop when you've worked around things that go wrong and have learned that most of the things that went wrong had been visible if you'd been looking. I walk the perimeter. I look. I write down what I see. Reyes was at the far end of the yard, near the water station, doing something with a length of nylon cord, some equipment repair, the specific fidgeting maintenance of a soldier who has been still all day and needs her hands occupied. The light was going that particular orange-gray it goes in the Afghan dusk, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's being observed from a slight remove, like a memory already in the process of forming. And she looked up when she heard me. I stopped, and there was a reasonable distance between us, far enough for neither of us to have to decide whether this was a conversation. I said, "How's the kit?" She said, "Good, sir." Flat. Not unfriendly. Plus, I mean the voice of someone who has accurately assessed that I'm neither her problem nor her solution and is reserving judgment accordingly. I nodded. I started walking again. Then she said, "Sir." I stopped. She was looking at the cord in her hands, not at me. Her voice was the same, flat, precise, the idiom of a person who measures their words because they've been taught the hard way that imprecision costs. "The letter in the file," she said. "Excessive force." "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment, working the cord. Then, "He dumped 5 liters, 1 punch. The math is the math, sir." She tied off the cord. She didn't look up. "Good evening," she said. I walked away. I wrote the last entry that night sitting on my bunk with my one small lamp and the notebook on my knee and the pen moving before I'd decided what I was going to say. Day 9. Reyes in yard at 1847. Basically, cord repair. Spoke briefly, letter in file. The math is the math. Correct. Then I, sat there. Oh, and I thought about Voss driving away from this fire base with his medical notation and his early retirement and his 22 years of careful architecture. The whole self-constructed edifice of a man who had never been challenged and had mistaken that unchallenged run for proof that he was unchallengeable. I thought about the yard, the way nobody had offered a hand, and I thought about what Harlan had said, worded carefully, and about the letter in Reyes's file that would sit next to the letter in Voss's file, and about how file letters are written in the same clean institutional font regardless of what they're describing, which is its own kind of violence. I thought pretty much about the next sergeant who would arrive here and look at 3rd Platoon and see Reyes in it, median scores, persistent, slightly slow on the run, and clock her as capable of not failing and file her there without looking underneath. But then I thought about what was underneath. Actually, I closed the notebook. Outside, I think, the window, the yard was dark and quiet, and the water can was at the station where she'd put it, full, exactly where it belonged. I thought about writing one more line. I didn't. Some things don't need to be written down to be recorded. 3 weeks later, Kowalski's transfer request was approved. He'd reapplied. In the remarks field, the optional one, the one that most soldiers leave blank because it doesn't change anything, he'd written 4 words that nobody officially acknowledged but that I heard repeated in variations 3 different times over the following month. I wrote them down. I basically wasn't sure why at the time. I think I know now. Things are different here.